Next is James Meikle, followed by Tyler Boyson. Is Tyler Boyson here? Okay, and then we will go to Commissioner Lance. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, members of the judiciary. My name is James Meikle, and I'm here representing the CCSU chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. For the sake of brevity, I'll be discussing topics relevant to Senate Bill 349 and House Bills 5445 and 6581. These are the three pieces of proposed legislation that relate to drug law reform. There's been a noticeable upswing in mentions of marijuana policy reform on the national stage, and this has largely been framed in the issue of the economic crisis. One of the most visible markers of this change in public discourse was an editorial in The Economist advocating drug law liberalization. They cited a variety of reasons, but they made specific note of financial concerns in their editorial. They are not a lone voice in the wilderness. A 1995 survey of economists found that over 50% of them were in favor of some degree of drug liberalization. Nor is The Economist making use of this transient financial concern to push their own personal agenda. They actually made their proposal decades ago, and this was simply a reprinted version of it. While we have considerable constraints on our budget currently, I believe that wasted money is wasted money whether we're spending it in good times or bad times. Therefore, I'd like to bring some historical perspective to the table. From 1973 to 1978, 10 states passed some manner of decriminalization legislation. This directly reduced arrests for what's known as simple possession, or possession without aggravating factors such as possession of firearms or possession of large quantities, by 36% in California, and similar numbers in other states that did proceed with the decriminalization route. As Senator Kissel pointed out, there is some concern that decriminalization would create a safe haven for dealers or increase demand in some way. California's experience shows that felony arrests actually remained static during this period of time. In other words, their decriminalization efforts really only did target the end user. They did not make it easier for people who are selling drugs, for people who are dealing drugs in a violent way. The economic benefits of this were actually quite substantial. Because of the combination of decreased incarceration and increased fine revenue, California was able to reduce its enforcement costs to, not by, but to 25% of what it had previously been, and it took only a single fiscal year for that to happen. The effect on our state budget is, of course, important to consider. There's the cited $11 million estimate. But there are also individual benefits gained by letting people return to their jobs, their schools, and their families without a permanent black mark on their record. There is the question of whether this individual benefit will be outweighed by the potential for increased use, which would carry social costs with it. Research shows that this probably is not the case. In surveys of people who do not use marijuana, most people state that they don't do so for health reasons rather than because of potential legal concerns. This shows that while marijuana use might have room to increase...
You can give a quick roundup, please.
Studies have shown that even if use does increase, which has not been the case in these prior 10 states that have decriminalized, even if it does, it's not likely to be a very significant increase. And given that evidence, I think that this is the potential to save costs for Connecticut while preserving individual freedoms.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your testimony. Are there any questions? Senator McLaughlin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony. I wonder, what is your thought about drug education in schools, and what was your personal experience about drug education in secondary school?
I did go through drug education. I think it was pretty much every year, and it was, I think, rather insufficient. It did cover the harms of drug use, but there was some degree of sort of sensationalized propaganda. It is true that there are harms associated with drug use, but for a large amount of drugs, the harm associated with it comes from the method of use rather than for the drug itself. For example, with marijuana use, there is potential for damage from inhalation from smoke. It does have carcinogens in the smoke, not to the same degree that tobacco does, but to enough to cause damage. but smoking is only the most common route of administration for marijuana because that's what people do at the moment. There are other technologies such as vaporizers, which let you simply inhale the active component without any carcinogens. Or you can create edible products with marijuana, or you can extract the oil so that it burns in a more healthy way. Drug education does not teach you how to do any of those things. It does not even tell you that those things are available. All it tells you is that marijuana can cause lung cancer. I think that this is a serious deficiency because if we're going to admit that people do use marijuana, we should probably admit that we should make that as safe as possible instead of trying to hide it, because it's not like they don't know about it already.
So you've just confirmed that I must be getting old because you talked about a marijuana vaporizer, and that's
Yes,
that's beyond my comprehension right now.
Well, what the active ingredient in marijuana is a volatile oil. In other words, as you apply heat to it, it forms a vapor. And this is the principle behind smoking. What you're actually getting is the smoke from the burning plant material, but also a vapor of the active ingredient. Now, vaporizers take advantage of the fact that these volatile compounds actually form a gas at a much lower temperature than the burning point of marijuana. It's possible to use a vaporizer, which is available online for not much more than the cost of a traditional smoking instrument, such as a bong. You can use one and not have to deal with burning plant matter and simply have the active ingredient. It works much in the same way as any other smoking device. You just inhale, but it's much, much safer.
Sir, that's breathtaking testimony, but I respectfully decline your proposal. I don't see it as being much common sense. You know, there's an organization that's prepared an event. I just happen to be looking at this. It's called Knowledge is Power, scheduled for March 30th, and this is the Courage to Speak Foundation, founded after Ginger and Larry Katz lost their son Ian to a drug overdose. And since then, the Courage to Speak Foundation has been dedicated to fulfilling a promise that Ginger made to Ian. She promised to do everything in her power to prevent this tragedy from happening to another family. But do you think that maybe we ought to dedicate some of our energies towards getting people not to start using drugs or continuing using drugs? I think that we're focused a little bit too much on vaporizers.
You're right. Actually, some of the research that I had read in preparation for this actually did indicate that, contrary to popular belief, drug education does have a significant degree of effect on drug use. It does decrease it. But I think it's important to take this in context. We're already doing drug education. We're still arresting people for using marijuana. We're still incarcerating people for using marijuana. Certainly drug education remains important, but that's not what's on the table today. What we're really discussing today is penalties for drug use, not drug education in specific.
No, I understand what's on the table today, but in the context of vaporizers, I thought maybe we should be spending a little more time with education on why not to do drugs than try this new Star Trek era of marijuana use.
I think a good analogy to this is sex education. Recently, a report came out on abstinence-only sex education, and what they found was that it was completely inefficient. We in Connecticut do have sex education that, for example, teaches how to use a condom. You could argue that, yes, this might increase rates of teenagers having sex, but the evidence doesn't really bear that out, and even if it did happen, it would probably still be safer than having some smaller amount to, have sex, but in a completely unsafe way. I think that this is a good parallel to drug education. Drug education is something that we should be doing, but we can't look at it in the sense of educating people how not to use drugs. We need to educate them how to not hurt themselves, and part of that is not using drugs, but part of that is, if they really are going to use drugs, doing it in a way that's not immensely dangerous to them. For example, use of intravenous drugs.
I guess, sir, we'll just agree to disagree on this, but thank you for your testimony.
I believe Representative Conway was next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. You seem like you did some research in preparation for your testimony and seem very, very well versed in the actual use of marijuana. So I think and young. So an appropriate person to maybe answer this question: should we be looking at our youth, and with this law, maybe if it does get passed through, having some restrictions in terms of age tied to it? I mean, did you participate in the recreational use of marijuana while you were in high school taking the drug education classes? And if you had not had that opportunity, do you think you'd use it today?
No, I actually have never used marijuana when I was in high school. Pretty much, I still don't. You know, I have done it on a handful of occasions, but that's really about all. I think that age restrictions are actually very important. I'm sure that some of you have found is that there really are more health hazards for young folks starting to use marijuana than for people who are later years of their teenage years. This isn't just something where we should avoid having kids do marijuana because we don't want kids doing it. They really actually do have significantly more risk of having psychotic symptoms from marijuana use if they start at an early age while the brain's still developing. I think it's very important that we look at age, but I think it's important we do it in a way based on evidence. If you look at studies that have been done on the availability of marijuana, it's actually easier for many people who are in high school to get marijuana than it is for them to get alcohol, because alcohol is only sold in places where you have to have ID. Marijuana, you know, if some dealers may not sell to you if you look like you're a kid, but some might because they're only in it to make money. I think that it's important to look at this not in terms of penalizing people more harshly if they're young, but doing whatever we can to avoid people from having any incentive to sell to young people in the first place.
And while we've done some of that with some of our laws, kids are going to get marijuana no matter what, and it's readily available from their own classmates. And you're probably right, more easily available than alcohol, and widely used. As much as, if not more than alcohol, by our high school youth. And I've just seen too many of them that through their utilization of that and alcohol, making bad decisions once they leave high school, entering college, and 6 months later returning home to try and get their act back together, which in some cases they do over a period of time and others don't. And it's very disheartening when you saw what was happening from the time they were young in high school, 14, 15 years old, participating in the use of both alcohol and marijuana or other drugs, and where that put them in, what position that put them in 3 years, 4 years later, entering college. And now to be able to say you can walk around with it, I think sends a possible harmful message. But thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Lawler?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. Thanks for coming to testify today. So I think I missed at the outset. Are you a student now?
Yes, I'm a student at CCSU.
And it seems interesting. I think you're aware there's this sort of national controversy about whether or not the drinking age should be lowered down to 18. And if you listen to the college presidents who have asked state legislatures and the federal Congress to at least think about it, they're saying that the fact that drinking is always illegal on college campuses, with the exception of the relatively few students who have already turned 21, has actually made the problem worse, right? There's more binge drinking, it's less likely to be supervised, it's a little bit out of control. And so since you're already on a college campus, as a general rule, can you characterize what's going on campus in terms of both drinking and smoking pot and potentially other drugs? The reason I asked the other drugs question, I've also heard that prescription medication is
becoming an increasingly problematic issue on college campuses, the abuse of that. So could you just, like, maybe from your perspective, just generally characterize what's actually happening there versus what we would like to see happening there?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad that you've asked me this question. I actually have experience at 2 universities. My first university was University of Toronto in Ontario, where the drinking age is 19. And we actually had a bar on campus run by the organization. I think that there really is a significant difference there. Yes, you did have drinking on both campuses. Yes, there's often drinking to excess on both campuses. But here's the difference. You didn't have people wandering off to a bar off campus just to go get drunk. You didn't have people doing underage drinking and trying to hide it from their RAs. If you had someone who was drinking to excess and you were really worried about them, you could tell the RA, and yes, they might get in trouble for it, but they weren't going to get kicked off campus for it. They would just have some kind of penalty applied to them or supervision applied to them. At CCSU, it's a dry campus, obviously, and there are actually large problems there with drinking, I would say. You can talk to people on campus, and they may not drink on campus, but even if they're underage, they certainly drink to a great degree. I think that if people are going to be drinking anyways, it's much better if we can monitor them, and with the amount of people who are in a dorm, I think it's much easier to do that than it is if they're all drinking at house parties or, you know, God forbid, drinking and driving because they can't do it where they live on campus.
And how about just the whether it's on campus or college-related activities going on off campus, can you just contrast the amount of, let's say, underage drinking versus use of marijuana versus prescription drug type stuff? I mean, just give it, because I mean, as you heard earlier, we're a bunch of old guys here and women, and so I think the main concern people have is for young people, right, ruining their lives on drugs, et cetera. And so I think it's interesting for us to get a general sense of what's actually happening there, not so much what we want to see happen, but what's actually happening. And if you could just fill in those blanks, that might be useful.
Yeah, I'd say that alcohol use is fairly widespread. I mean, you have people who are clearly not of age feeling comfortable enough about it that they just talk about it randomly in the student center about how drunk they got one night. You know, that's something where it may not be affecting them, but it may, because there are some people who really do have problems. They can't just get drunk on some weekend because they'll get drunk on the next weekend and the next. If I had to guess, I'd say that a majority use alcohol to some degree, and out of that majority, a much smaller number really use it in a very dangerous way. Marijuana use, I'm not too familiar with. I'm not really in the circles that use it. I know that it does exist on campus, that it's really something people try and avoid doing in the dorms because it's much easier to detect because of the odor. Alcohol is also easy to detect, so usually people won't do drugs on campus, but I would say that drug use does exist among people who are on campus.
And how about the prescription drug stuff? Do you hear
a
fair amount about that?
Prescription drug issues, I think there's two sort of issues there. One is the use of prescription drugs that are typically painkillers or anti-anxiety medications. These are particularly dangerous because if they're combined with alcohol, since they're depressants, they're much more likely to lead to overdoses. I'm not too familiar with that around here, but I know that it has been growing greatly. I had seen some statistics for the use of opiates for monitoring overdoses. And what they found is that consistently the amount of people using heroin has decreased, while the amount of people using synthetic drugs has increased. And those synthetic drugs are essentially diverted painkillers. It's impossible to prevent someone, once they have their prescription, from selling it to someone else or from having that prescription stolen. Even if every prescription is given by doctors in good faith, there's still going to be a black market for this, especially because what's pain management for one person with terminal cancer is enough to get a whole room full of people high if it's divided out that way, just because of the difference in scale of pain. The other issue I think that bears looking into is prescription stimulants being diverted. These are more and more common for people who have diagnosis of attention deficit disorder, and they do have a legitimate role to be played there. But the difficulty is that these drugs don't just work on people with attention deficit disorder, they work on anyone and increase their attention. This has not only health implications, because these drugs can cause, for example, cardiac issues. If someone's on these prescriptions, they should really be screened for those in advance of taking them. But more importantly, there are some academic integrity sort of issues there. You have people who are doing something illegal to get a benefit academically, and it really is a benefit academically. You can certainly perform much better while you're on these substances. It strikes me as very unfair to have that kind of situation existing, because you don't want to reward people for breaking the law to give them better grades for it. And that's the current situation that we have.
It's interesting because I think this is the kind of stuff that like terrifies parents who are contemplating sending their kids to college, but at the same time, I think it really calls for us as policymakers to try and find effective ways of dealing with this, not just sort of burying our head in the sand kind of ways, which sometimes just having tough penalties without any real consequences in terms of the outcomes. But it's a very interesting dilemma, and I think many people would be surprised at what actually happens on college campuses. I teach at a college, and I hear all the stories about kids students being transported to hospitals because they've usually mixed alcohol with some other stuff. Never marijuana-related problems, but always these other things. And it's an interesting dilemma how we best get it under control, whether banning it outright or somehow regulating it and having more oversight. When I was in college, the drinking age was 18, so there was plenty of drinking going on, but at the same time, we didn't see the kind of outcomes we see today. So it's interesting. Are there further questions? Senator Kissel?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to compliment you on your calm approach to the issue, and awful lot of research obviously went into your testimony, and we maybe take it for granted sitting here going through hearing after hearing after hearing, but it's not easy. Public speaking and testifying in public on such a sensitive issue takes a lot of bravery. So I just want to compliment you on that. Regarding the marijuana proposal, I have in the past supported the medical marijuana proposal, but it seems like that's just never going to get through this building. And my concern is that if we can't even do something for someone who may be terminally ill or suffering from a very bad disease, I don't know how we can possibly take this step. But along those lines, when bills were passed in the state of California and for medical marijuana, I've heard and I've seen on different news programs that people abuse that system and that it's very easy to get a prescription and to then go get a bunch of marijuana and use it recreationally. Do you have any background information on how that's working out in California, and perhaps if there are other states that have moved in this direction, for example, via the referenda in Massachusetts, are they approaching this issue differently?
Well, I actually have an anecdote that may be appropriate here. I know a fellow who does graphic design for a lot of medical marijuana clinics there, their signs, that sort of thing. And before the changes that had been announced by the Obama administration, that essentially they've declared that they're only going to go after medical marijuana clinics if it's in both violation of federal and state law instead of just in violation of federal law. Before that announcement, he described it as they wanted very subdued logos, that they wanted to look more like a medical establishment. And then after that announcement, it was pot leaves everywhere, just all over their logos. I think that's not really a very pretty picture of what's going on there, and it does back up what's going on. Yes, a significant amount of people are getting prescriptions for marijuana who probably don't need it. There have been cases where people have outright said, yeah, I lied about it, but now I have my card, so you can't do anything about it. I think that this isn't a very good solution, that there are people who legitimately do need medical marijuana, but you're really kind of creating this avenue for people to get marijuana and not really have much oversight in it. If you're going to have that kind of system, I think it does need to be better regulated, but I also don't think that this says anything about any decriminalization efforts. I think that decriminalization and medical marijuana really do deserve to be looked at as two separate issues. Should marijuana have imprisonment or a fine? And should we allow marijuana to be used in its plant form as a medication? There are already prescription drugs that mimic the effects of it, but they do have some sort of financial sort of burden that the plant itself does not. You can't grow your own prescription drugs. So again, I really think it's important that they be seen as two different issues. And the medical marijuana one, there is some concern over diverted prescriptions or illicit prescriptions, but I think all you have to do there is look at the amount of harm that's been done by this. There haven't been any reports coming out saying there's been a huge increase in lung cancer rates. There haven't been any reports saying there's a huge increase in schizophrenia. It really does seem to be that these are people taking advantage of a system who, if it were decriminalized, they'd take advantage of that system.
And just as a follow-up, and I don't know if you have the history on this, but the whole notion that there was a period of time in American history, the turn of the last century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, where it actually looked as if marijuana was going to be a legal substance, perhaps regulated but legal. And then all of a sudden, I'm not quite sure what occurred, but you had the demonization of marijuana. You had movies like Reefer Madness and everything else like that, and somehow it got itself on this list of other really hardcore drugs that were very, very dangerous to individuals as far as addiction and negative side effects. And I'm just wondering if you know what prompted all of that, if you've stumbled into it in your research.
Yes, there are actually some very good documentaries and websites about this. It really did start because of racism. Essentially, you had a large degree of Hispanic immigrants who people didn't like very much, a large degree of African Americans that people didn't like very much, and guess what? They used a lot of marijuana compared to the average person who may not even have heard of it by that point in time, just because it hadn't spread to the degree that it has today. It was also much less potent than it is today, which doesn't really say anything about safety. It just says that it was a different drug then than it is now. When you look at that, what happened there, you had people making outlandish claims about what it did, as you said, reefer madness. There were already claims of psychosis. There's current research about how it causes psychosis, but this was really just smoking it will make you crazy, which is a very different thing. There's actually been government efforts to work against that propaganda, but government is not a monolithic entity. There's a large degree of separation. You have commissions and agencies giving reports that it's not that dangerous, it doesn't do what people are saying it is. But on the other hand, if you look at the so-called drug czar position, he's actually not allowed by the terms that created his position to advocate for reducing the schedule of something. He actually can't speak as to that. He simply must remain silent if he does advocate for that. I think it's a very complex issue to look at the history of that, because you have something that racism still exists in some forms, but not to the same outright degree that it did then. But that same propaganda exists to this day. And it's very hard to say that it was due to racism without really intense study of that. A lot of people aren't going to do that. They're just going to see the propaganda that's been around for 80, 100 years by now and look at that. To really convince them to look deeper is very difficult, especially when it is an illegal substance, because who's going to look more deeply at an illegal substance? People who are already using the illegal substance. People who don't really have strong opinions about it or who are even against it, I feel it is going to be much more difficult to get them to look into that issue.
Thank you. And as Chairman Lawler indicated, he said that parents get really nervous when looking at these issues. And I got to be honest, I have a 5-year-old son, Tristan, and a 13-year-old son, Nathaniel. Well, 13, the way time seems to be going, I'm going to blink and he's going to be 18 or 19 or 20. And, maybe with any luck, be able to go to college and all of that. But at some point, as a dad or a mom or a guardian, if you have little ones, eventually you have to let go. That's the nature of life. And so, yeah, my initial gut reaction is, no, this can't be good. But I I have to give it an awful lot of thought. For those who might be watching on the CT network in my district, in my 7 towns, let me know your opinions regarding this, because on the one hand, I don't want to create a situation that sort of entices people to make bad decisions, but on the other hand, I don't know if we want a system that condemns someone before they even spread their wings and can realize their potentiality as an adult human being. And it's a struggle between those two things. One last question, and it sprang from what you had just stated. In Europe, there are countries that have gone the way of legalizing various drugs, marijuana. I think Copenhagen and Denmark, there's places in Switzerland, and while there was a lot of promise going into that, basically the same notion of why incarcerate individuals, and in fact I think they even went so far as to have certain areas of public parks set aside and everything else like that. The latest I've heard is that they're trying to pull back from those policies because they've spun out of control. Is this something that's sort of been done in other countries, and that maybe we can learn from their mistakes?
I think that the mistake there is really one that plays out from the interaction of international drug policy. Here you have this country where marijuana is not outright legal in the same sense that we might use to describe that, but it's certainly much more free than it is here. If you look at who's actually causing these disruptions, these problems in their use, it's largely tourists. It's people going there because they want to smoke marijuana and they want to do it out in public and not be worried. And it's these people who go there, and you're only there for a week, why not get as high as you can? It's the same kind of thing that happens crossing the border in Canada. Going from a drinking age of 21 to 18, you can legally cross, you can legally drink, and you can get as drunk as you want. So if you're going to go through the effort of doing that, why not get really, really drunk? I think that to some degree, a lot of these problems are just caused by that kind of international strife. If you look at other areas where there may not be full legalization, but there's decriminalization or even just de facto decriminalization. For example, I had been in Ontario, and while there are still penalties for marijuana use, they're rarely enforced. There's an area of Toronto that's essentially like the Times Square of that city. And I was just walking along randomly, and someone asked me for a light on their joint. That's just the kind of system that they have there. They're much more free about it. And there doesn't seem to be much use of marijuana in very dangerous ways. It's also kind of hard to think about what the dangerous use of marijuana would be as compared to something like alcohol. For example, there have been studies on driving under the influence of marijuana. Obviously, this is not something that should be done. We already have laws against it. But what they found is that it's simply not as dangerous as even talking on a cell phone while you're driving. Looking at lung cancer rates, yes, they might go up, but evidence shows that they're probably not going to go up by as much as people smoking nicotine would. Alcohol directly contributes to cancers. It is likely that it has more of an effect on cancer than marijuana use does, based on what we know currently. I think that even if decriminalization did lead to rampant use, which it really has not, except in the case of areas that have a lot of tourism, where it has been a legitimate problem, and that is part of the effort to roll back some of their laws, or in some cases to restrict laws so that they're only applicable to residents instead of tourists. I think that there really is potential to do this in a very safe, controlled way and not have to deal with those consequences. So as more states start doing it, then you don't have that same tourism effect, and people are content to just stay where they are instead of creating problems somewhere else, which could be here in Connecticut, admittedly.
Thank you once again for your very thoughtful testimony.
Anything further? If not, thanks for your patience and thoroughness in your testimony. It was very helpful.
Thank you for letting me speak.